Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, the issue we're confronting today is one that deals with the separation of powers outlined in the United States Constitution. You see, our system of government was set up in such a way as to protect the people from the dangers associated with the excessive accumulation of power in the hands of the few. We knew from our experience under British rule that bad things happen, especially at a national level, when too few people exercise too much of the power. Nowhere is this more evident than in the case of the war power. In fact, much of the revolutionary struggle that led to the creation of our nation resulted from wartime activities undertaken by a monarch thousands of miles and an ocean away. It's important today that we remember those same concerns and the constraints placed into our Constitution as we run our government nearly 2.5 centuries later. I'm happy to be here with my colleague, Senator Sanders, to file a discharge motion for our resolution, S.J. Res. 54. Now, whether you're present in the chamber today, physically with us, or whether you're tuning in at home, I hope you'll listen closely so that we can fill you in on the unauthorized Middle East war that your government, the government of the United States of America, is supporting and actively participating in as a co-belligerent. This war in Yemen has killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians, human beings, lest we forget, each one of them possessing innate, immeasurable worth and dignity. This war has created refugees, orphans, widows. It has cost millions of dollars. And believe it or not, at the end of the day, it actually has quite arguably undermined our fight against terrorist threats such as ISIS. I'll expand on these unfortunate facts in a moment, but for now, let's just focus on one thing. Our military's involvement in Yemen has not been authorized by Congress, as required by the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states that Congress shall have the power to declare war. Congress, not the President, not the Pentagon, not someone else within the executive branch of government, but Congress. Yet, in 2015, then-President Obama initiated our military involvement in Yemen and did so without authorization from Congress. The current administration has continued Obama's war. Senator Sanders, Senator Murphy, our co-sponsors, and I are now giving Congress a chance to fix this error by debating and voting on our nation's continued involvement in this unauthorized illegal war in Yemen. Now, if, as our opponents claim, this war is necessary, then surely they can defend that argument before this body and before the House of Representatives and ultimately secure authorization from Congress, just as the Constitution demands under Article 1, Section 8. But if, on the other hand, they cannot defend this war, and they cannot persuade a majority of members of this body and a majority of members of the House of Representatives that this is a war that needs to be fought, then it needs to end. Let's have an honest reckoning about this war today. Before this debate gets underway in earnest, there are a few points that I'd like to clarify. First, let's talk about Iran for just a moment. Yes, the Houthis did fire on a U.S. Navy vessel. This only reinforces the fact that Yemenis view the United States as a participant in this war, regardless of whether or not Congress wants to acknowledge that participation or approve it, as the Constitution requires. But overall, there are conflicting reports about the extent of Iranian support for the Houthi rebels. What we do know is this: the Houthis are a regional rebel group that does not itself threaten the United States While the Houthis are no friends of ours, neither are they a serious threat to American national security. The longer we fight against them, the more reason we give them to hate America and embrace the opportunists who are our true enemy in the region, Iran. And the more we prolong activities that destabilize the region, the longer we harm our own interests in terms of trade and broader regional security. The bottom line, Mr. President, is this. We're spending a great deal of time and treasure to defeat a regional rebel group with no desire to attack the homeland and unclear ties to Iran. Iran's influence is much clearer in other parts of the Middle East with other groups. For example, with the murderous terrorist group Hezbollah. So if we want to counter Iran, let's have that debate in Congress and vote to equip this administration with the necessary authorization to use our vast and fearsome military resources to defeat its proxies, not to create new proxies by turning rebel groups against us. Let's talk about ISIS for a moment. Our resolution would not impede the military's ability to fight terror groups like ISIS inside Yemen. The resolution itself requires the removal of U.S. forces from hostilities in Yemen, except, and I quote, United States Armed Forces engaged in operations directed at al-Qaeda or associated forces, close quote. That is a direct quote from the text of the resolution itself. It should put to rest this notion that this would somehow jeopardize our ability to fight terrorists. The Pentagon and the executive branch have long insisted that it has adequate authority under the authorization for the use of military force enacted in 2001. Adequate authority under the 2001 AUMF to fight against ISIS. So if they, at the Pentagon and elsewhere in the executive branch, or if any of my colleagues now claim that this resolution specifically needs to exempt operations against ISIS, then what are we to make of their previous confidence in the 2001 AUMF? Have they suddenly lost faith in that document overnight? Or are they merely using this argument as a pretense to oppose our resolution? I personally believe that the 2001 AUMF has been stretched too far. Our resolution, however, is completely agnostic on this point. It's entirely agnostic about whether counter-terror operations against al-Qaeda and ISIS can proceed in the wake of the resolution. Our resolution is specific, and our resolution relates specifically to the Houthis. Nothing in this bill may be interpreted as an AUMF. Lastly, with regard to Saudi Arabia and the ongoing visit of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Washington, D.C. at the moment, I've been deeply concerned about our illegal war in Yemen since its inception and have taken steps to end our involvement in that war. I presented questions to our combatant commanders on the topic, just as I have for other unauthorized operations in the past. I had hoped the new administration might take prompt action to end our unauthorized activities in Yemen. Sadly, that has not occurred. So last fall, after countless missed opportunities and some broken assurances, my colleagues and I decided it was time to take matters into our own hands. And by matters, I mean those matters that are specifically already in our hands, those matters that are already granted to the United States Congress and to no other branch of government. There may be some short-term impact on the U.S.-Saudi relationship, but overall, the Crown Prince should understand that this protracted and clearly non-conclusive war only hurts his government's stability and legitimacy. He, too, should want a quick end to this conflict. Saudi Arabia is an indispensable partner in the region, without which the United States would be less successful. But the Saudis themselves are at an inflection point within their own government. Working with the United States should be a goal for the Crown Prince and should be a credibility-lending endeavor. The resolution before you is the product of years of effort. It was not timed in any way, shape, or form to coincide with the Crown Prince's visit. It was drafted with one thing in mind, which is to make sure that before we put U.S. blood and treasure on the line, before we put the sons and daughters of the American people who serve in harm's way into an area in which hostilities are ongoing, to get involved in combat capacities in an area where conflict is brewing. We owe it to them, we owe it to their parents, we owe it to their families. We owe it to ourselves, having taken an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, to do it the right way. Not just because the Constitution requires that, but also because of the reasons why the Constitution requires that. It makes sense that when we're doing something that has a greater capacity to impact our government, our standing in the world, our own security, and the lives of those who were sworn to protect us, that we do it in the right way, not just through the appropriate branch of government, but through the appropriate branch of government, in part because that's the only place where an open, honest, public debate can occur. It's one thing to make a decision somewhere within the military chain of command on whether to undertake a particular action, but this is one of the reasons why, in order to declare war, in order to get us involved in a war in the first place, it requires action by Congress, because this is the branch of the federal government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. Over the course of many decades, under the leadership of Congresses and White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination, you've seen a gradual shift of power in a number of areas, including regulatory policy, including trade policy, and including the exercise of the war power over to the executive branch of government. When we don't exercise that power, it starts to atrophy. The Constitution means less, and it is less able to protect the American people. That's why this resolution matters. That's why I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. Let's do this the right way. Thank you, Mr. President. It is Congress that gets to decide whether or not we go to war. It is not the executive branch. And for that very same reason, when we have brought up this resolution, calling the question on whether or not we have authorized that war and whether or not we should continue in the absence of an authorization for that war, if we are asked to table that, that very request amounts to a request for abdication of our constitutional responsibility. A favorite song of mine called Free Will by the band Rush came out several decades ago. It says, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. If we choose in this moment to table this resolution, we are making a choice to be willfully blind to the exercise of a power that belongs to us, to allow someone else to exercise it without proper authority. That is wrong. That cannot happen, not on our watch. Time to time may ask us how we would define the term hostilities and what the United States might be doing that triggers that definition. I welcome that discussion. It's important to note that U.S. Code is somewhat vague as to that question, defining hostilities broadly to mean any conflict subject to the laws of war. I don't necessarily view that broad definition as problematic. It is something that allows Congress to assess the unique circumstances in each instance on specific grounds at each point in time. Our involvement in war and in conflict has greatly changed over the years, and it'll continue to change as the nature of international relations changes, as the technology that we use in war changes and develops. That doesn't mean that we're not involved in hostilities. I welcome further discussion on this matter. So let's look at the facts of our involvement in Yemen today. Since 2015, U.S. forces have aided the Saudi coalition with mid-air refueling and target selection assistance. Or as Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said in December 2017, our military is helping the Saudis, quote, make certain they hit the right thing, close quote. So in other words, we're helping a foreign power bomb its adversaries in multiple ways. If that doesn't include and amount to and itself constitute hostilities, then such words have lost their meaning. Now, there are those within the executive branch of government who would define the term hostilities so narrowly that it would apply only when our armed service personnel are on the ground firing upon or being fired upon by an enemy force. It's understandable in some respects that they'd want to define it this way, because if they define it that way, that puts the executive in power. It's one of the reasons why we have to remember that there is a natural tension built into our constitutional structure to make sure that not all power is concentrated in any one branch of government. It's one of the reasons why, as Alexander Hamilton pointed out in Federalist number 69, the war power would not be exercised by the executive in our system of government. In this instance, as in many others, the executive in our system of government would differ from the monarch under the old system, the one that was based in London. You see, the king had the power to take Great Britain to war. The king didn't have to seek a declaration of war from Parliament. The king could act in and of himself to decide when to take us to war. It's one of the reasons why it matters here. But when we see the definition of hostilities narrowed to the point that it very often will not exist, given the way we engage in hostilities today, given modern technologies that frequently allow us to engage in acts that anyone would have to acknowledge amount to combat, amount to conflict, amount to hostilities, they can still explain it away as something that the executive can do independently of Congress. Now, this resolution actually will not do anything, according to some, because we're not engaged in hostilities in Yemen. This building upon this argument that's based on a very narrow, cramped, distorted interpretation of the word hostilities. And so when people ask, what do we think the resolution would do if it would pass? Well, first of all, it's clear that we are engaged in hostilities, because when we're involved in as a co-belligerent, involved in mid-air refueling in combat flights, when we're identifying targets for the Saudi-led military coalition in Yemen against the Houthis, those are combat operations. Those are clearly hostilities. But even if we were to suppose that U.S. activities in Yemen somehow did not constitute hostilities, according to the War Powers Resolution, the text of our resolution is crystal clear about what constitutes hostilities for its purposes, namely, quote, aerial targeting assistance, intelligence sharing, and mid-flight aerial refueling. Our resolution would end those very specific activities against the Houthis in Yemen. Nothing more and nothing less. Yeah. Mr. President.
Yes, Senator from Utah.
One of the other questions we get from time to time is, Senator Sanders mentioned some previous wars and how this may or may not relate to those previous wars. It's also a related question that we get: how does this impact or influence operations where the United States is engaged somewhere else in the world? Would the passage of this resolution mean that every other type of operation anywhere else in the world would have to stop too? And what about our global counterterrorism activities? We sometimes get those questions. The main reason we drafted this resolution was to bring our activities in Yemen into line with our laws as expressed in the Constitution. So if we're fighting unauthorized wars in other places around the globe, then those wars need to be authorized by Congress, or else they would need to end. Importantly, however, this resolution does not itself make law or set precedent for other operations. This resolution applies just to this conflict in Yemen against the Houthis. Each conflict or operation ought to be evaluated on its own merits and measured against our national interest and any existing authorizations for the use of military force. So we can't evaluate this resolution as being something that requires us to swallow the entire elephant at once. This is just focusing on one issue in one part of the world. And we need not take any kind of a sky-is-falling approach that will say this will immediately jeopardize everything else we're doing anywhere and every other, in any and every other part of the world. Now, global counterterror operations under Title 10 or Title 50 involve U.S. action, but arise in different ways. And any other activity that we undertake or authority that we cite in introducing our armed service personnel into hostilities cannot serve as a substitute for congressional action as contemplated by the Constitution. The power to declare war belongs to Congress and not to the executive. Just because government breaks the rules often, and sometimes with impunity, does not mean it has the right to break the rules. Nor does it mean, certainly, that we shouldn't call out rule breaking where we see it going on. But that's a debate for another day. The resolution before us today is specific to our activities against the Houthis in Yemen. It does not authorize or deauthorize military force in any other part of the globe against any other foe. In fact, the resolution specifies that it does not interfere with existing operations against al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Our resolution is narrowly tailored to end our efforts to assist forces fighting against the Houthis. It is deliberately narrowed to address a black and white situation clearly not covered by any existing authorization for the use of military force. Counter-terror operations supported by the 2001 AUMF and other legitimate authorizations will not be affected by this resolution.